anything you want to say about the big guy that we had early on this morning?
Well, it's been a long time since I've seen a bear that fat. So why that bear? And most of the other bears are nowhere near that condition. It's hard to say. We always sort of ponder: is it just like he's like a super good hunter? Did he just get lucky? Did he find a dead whale out there? And that's the question. I mean, I think if it's a dead whale, you would probably see more bears that if it was a dead bowhead whale, and there are bowheads out in the Hudson Bay system, you'd think more bears would get that fat. So you think, maybe he's a really skilled hunter, but I think it's probably more than that. My guess is probably a bear like that got into a good place where there's a bunch of bearded seals. Bearded seals are, upwards of 400 kilos, 900 pounds. You kill a few of those, and remember, if you eat 100 pounds of seal fat, you're going to get about 94 pounds right in your own fat cells. So these guys can eat easily that much in a single meal. So obviously a bear like that just was taking in a lot of calories. And it's interesting because, he's already been on shore for 3 months or so, and he must have been monstrous.
Yeah, Lisa had said that earlier. Just think how big he must have been in June when he came off the ice, or early July there.
We used to see a lot more bears like that. Particularly, in sort of August when the bears are first coming off the ice back in the 1980s and 90s, and we just don't see many bears. But it's interesting because we saw pretty much the full spectrum. I mean, that guy for this time of year is sort of like a 5 body condition. We do them on a 1 to 5 scale, but we had within half an hour we had a bear walk by who was clearly a nice solid 2. If the ice doesn't come back, that bear's not going to be doing well. I mean, the ice is going to come back. It's just a question if it comes back, in the month of November, December, or not. Right now, we're not getting much ice in the bay, so you look around and there's a little bit of slushy bits here. Most of that's just freshwater ice because the Churchill River puts out a lot of fresh water and it comes along the shore. But we're not going to see any serious freeze up here. I think we need to see the temperatures drop, and looking at the forecast, it's not really cold this week.
No, we're just hovering around freezing. We were commenting on that this morning. It was not real cold this morning, -10 C, but it's supposed to get to right around freezing today, and it's apparent, we don't even have our gloves on when we go outside, so it's pretty warm out.
It's and that's the issue here. When we look at a population, everybody knows the old sort of question or issue of a bell curve, right? There's sort of this what we call a normal distribution or a bell curve. It goes up. Most of the bears are kind of in the middle. There's always bears that are out on the ends, and this year the bears, that middle bear is actually doing quite well, especially when you compare it to about 5-6 years ago, when we had bears that just most of the bears in the population sort of looked like just a bunch of bones with skin hanging and fur on them. It was pretty grim, and we that was the year we had females with cubs that were clearly not doing well because they weren't nursing anymore. The mom had stopped producing milk, and a lot of those cubs we know died. So the problem is you get a good year like this and you think, oh, well, that's great, but it's just these systems are really noisy. We've always had that noise. We always had good years and bad years. The problem is now we just get a lot more bad years than good years. And those bad years really can make the population click downwards in abundance. But it takes many good years to rebuild the population. We're only going to grow this population at 2 or 3% a year. But we could easily lose 5 or 10% of the population in a tough year. So it's a bit of a numbers game, and the problem is there was a new paper that just came out in it's Nature Climate Change, and they really paint a pretty grim picture for this part of the world for sea ice going forward. By mid-century, certainly this area looks like it will cease to function for polar bears. Well, based on sea ice, it could happen actually a lot sooner than that. They were saying their estimations were that by the end of the century, there would be 365 days of ice-free Hudson Bay.
And where are we at right now for ice-free days on the bay?
Yeah, we're sort of hovering sort of in that 150, 160. In some, there's, again, it's a lot of variation. We follow some of the bears by satellite collars, and some of the bears were off the ice 3 weeks before others. And this is just sort of the luck of the draw. Maybe you ended up in a patch of ice that was more stable, a little thicker. The way the ice was drifting, you managed to stay on it. You kept hunting, you do better. Other bears get into a place where the ice is breaking down and they just have to bail for shore. And, so 3 extra weeks on shore, you're burning 2 pounds every day of body fat, 1 kilogram roughly. So, an extra 21 days. Did you come ashore with that 21 extra kilos or 40 pounds of fat or not? And if you did, you're fine. Like the big boy we saw here today, he's got no problem. He could go for months right now and not have an issue. The skinnier male we saw go by, I think if he's not back out on the ice in a month and killing something, it's not just getting back out on the ice, but he's actually got to get something to eat. He's
got to be able to find a place where there are the seals maintaining their breathing holes, or some leads where there's some seals hanging out where he can start clobbering them, huh?
Exactly. And so we know that ring seals, which is the primary prey of polar bears, over 80% of their diet around this area, they actually, as soon as the ice sets up, the males actually set up their territories. Now, technically, actually, it's not a territory, it's a maritory, because terra means land, but mara means marine. So anyways, they set up these areas that they're going to defend from other seals. They want to have sort of their own private area, and hopefully some females will set up and have their pups in that area. So it's kind of the way this system works. It basically all depends on the sea ice. And the sea ice, if you change the characteristics of the sea ice, you change the characteristics of the ecosystem, and different species live in a place if you change the setup of the ecosystem. And that sea ice is just the most fundamental defining characteristic of these Arctic marine ecosystems.
So you were mentioning last night in a talk on the Tundra Buggy Lodge, if the sea ice does, if we don't mitigate our greenhouse gas emissions and the sea ice does disappear here by the end of the century, there'll still be an ecosystem here, but it's going to be a different ecosystem.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, we're already seeing that. I mean, you talk to any of the locals in Churchill or the local people in the Inuit communities north of here, they're seeing far more killer whales than they ever used to. Why is that? Well, less ice just means that the killer whales can come in a lot sooner. And that's a perfect scenario for them to come in here, and they can start to feed on things like ring seals that are spending the summer out in the open water. So ring seals and bearded seals are adapted to try to stay away from polar bears, but they're not well adapted to staying away from killer whales. So new top dog in town, and that would be the killer whale eventually. We'll start to see more North Atlantic, North Pacific species. We would expect harp seals to come in here, more harbor seals. We'd probably get minke whales, which are all species that we see on the edges of the ice zones. But it's the narwhal, the belugas, the bowheads, the polar bears, ring seals, bearded seals, those really ice-dependent species that will slip away on us.
Boy, we don't want to see that happen. We got some questions coming in here. Looks like Lacey, how far inland do they go when the sea ice melts? So how far are the bears traveling inland once the ice disappears on the bay in the summer?
Yeah, hey Lacey, it varies. The males, they're kind of the beach boys of the polar bear world. They just hang out on the coast. They don't want to go anywhere. The big males own this area. They're not scared of anybody, and they're actually kind of social with each other. So the males stay on the coast. Subadults, they kind of just cast to the wind. They go hither and yon. They don't really seem to have any plan. They're just kind of wandering here and there. The females easily going in up to 100 kilometers, so about 60, 70 miles inland. They go a long ways, particularly the pregnant females. They seem to go the farthest inland, and it's always been a bit of a mystery why they go so far inland. Especially, you think you're big, you're fat, it's hot and buggy. Why are you going to walk way inland to make a den and sit there all winter? And then you've got these little cubs that are, little polar bear cubs are incredibly cute, but they're kind of ginky. They don't walk very well. They kind of bumble around. They're kind of clumsy, but then they got to walk all this way out to the coast, and it can take them several days to walk that distance. But what we suspect is they probably just want peace and quiet, staying away from other bears. So a few years ago was when we had a really big melt out in the Arctic of sea ice. It was 2007. We had polar bears way inland, like several hundred kilometers, so a couple hundred miles. They were just lost. They got separated from the ice and they just started looking for things to eat. Most of the bears that were spotted, they were shot, mainly because they just wandered into small communities and they were so skinny that it was just desperation time.
And probably communities, if they were that far inland, that aren't accustomed to dealing with polar bears, huh?
Exactly. In a lot of those places would have grizzly bears coming around, but it was pretty clear that these bears were in desperate shape. There was one in Alaska and one in Northwest Territories that they got way, way off base.
So we got some questions also about the bears digging and kind of bedding down in this area. Are they just trying to make a soft place for them to sit, or why are they kind of burrowing into the snow and kelp here?
I think they just want to get comfortable. When you go down the coast here, they make these sort of nice depressions. We call them beds, and they basically just make these nice round things. It's kind of like, when you watch your dog go into its pillow. Even my dog sort of scratches it and, tries to move it around. I mean, it's a pillow, dog, but, relax. But they go around and around in circles, and the bears kind of do the same thing. And they're just like people. They want to be comfortable. And, we see them out here. Sometimes they'll lie down and rest their head on a stone or a block of ice. And it just, whatever feels good, you do it.
So if we do get less and less sea ice here, Andy, will the polar bears be able to adapt to find food closer to shore or on shore here?
No, that's kind of a lost cause. And, people always throw that up, and it's kind of the hopeful option. The problem we've got is basically we've done that experiment in time. If you go back 10, 12,000 years ago, we had polar bears down as far south as the southern parts of Sweden, southern parts of Norway, Denmark, and that part of Scandinavia. As the climate, and of course that was because it was a cold period. We had an ice age. It was the tail end of the ice age. We've got great polar bear fossils from that period in that part of the world. But the bears didn't become more terrestrial. They didn't sort of adapt to those conditions. They just left. They died out there. Of course, as a species, they moved northwards. The problem we've got going forward is we can't keep pushing this species northward. We're in a relative, interglacial period, and it's continuously warming. And this is the problem with the current path we're on is it's directional, and so we're going to keep warming unless we do something about it. And that's where the COP21 in Paris really provides us with a chance to change our current trajectory.
I think we got time for just one or two more questions, and then we have a broadcast that we'll be setting up for here and encourage you to tune in for. As the climate has changed, Andy, do you notice a change in their health, or do you see any more diseases here with the polar bears? That's a really good question.
It is, and it's kind of interesting. It's one of the great and challenging things is polar bears start at a baseline. Polar bears don't have many parasites, almost none, very few diseases. If they get something like rabies, they just die. We know that. But they are seemingly picking up new diseases and new parasites. And this is something that's broadly predicted under climate change. We'll start to see more diseases moving into places because new species show up and they bring new parasites and disease with them. We did some work when I worked in the Norwegian Arctic for the Norwegian government. We were looking at some of the parasites in polar bears there. And one of the things we noticed was that in a fairly short span of time, we were seeing an increase in some of these single-cell protozoan parasites that were almost doubling in abundance in their presence in polar bears. So we don't know what these things do. We can see brucellosis in the bears. Seals have brucellosis. We see all sorts of distemper viruses, canine and phocine. Phocine would be a seal distemper. We don't know what they mean. We don't know what brucellosis means. We know it's really bad for cattle and for like hoofed animals, but we have no idea what it does to polar bears. So it's a challenge, and it's one of the things that scientists try to monitor. We try to, we can use blood samples and try to see what they're actually exposed to. But it's kind of one of the big mystery components out there. and it's hard to monitor all these different things. And part of the problem is it's expensive to do all those analyses. I mean, we could get samples, but then you need to have somebody run the analyses in a lab, and those are really costly. We're looking for ways to try to monitor polar bear health. We do work with pollutants. We do work with looking at stress hormones, and it's really expensive work to do. I mean, we were doing a study on polar bear hair. So when polar bear researchers catch polar bears, they quite often take a small hair sample, and we were looking at cortisol levels, which is a stress hormone in the hair. And it costs us $60 a sample. We were really lucky. We had a nonprofit from the United Kingdom called Hauser Bears. They provided us with $40,000 of funding to do those samples. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a clue. So, and it's we're trying to develop new methods of monitoring these animals.
Well, there isn't really anything inexpensive in the polar bear research world, is there?
No, I don't own a sailboat, but you talk to sailors, they say if it's on a sailboat, triple the price. Well, you talk about the polar bears in Arctic, and you almost have to do the same thing. The way I explain it to my grad students when we're out, doing work in a helicopter, it's like we have a bag of $50 bills on the back seat, and every minute you let one go out the window. Not actually, but that's what it costs to be in a helicopter, about $50 a minute. So, when you're out there and you're thinking we need data, and especially if you want to get your master's or your doctorate, we need data to make some insights, and it's expensive work. It's really not cheap.
Well, Andy, we probably got to wrap up here. Thanks for your thoughts there on the questions here coming from the Explore community. We do have a webcast coming up in about 20 minutes. This is Tundra Connections, Polar Bears International Tundra Connections webcast. I'll talk to Jonathan here to see if we could maybe get it shot over to the Explore page as well. If you're interested, polarbearsinternational.org. We'll have that on our webcast or on our website. And then later today, we have a COP21 live chat here right in the Explore community on the Explore cams. So thanks, everybody, for your questions, and we will be back with you a little bit later.